When Hollywood cameraman Bob Samuels was found shot dead execution style, his wife found herself starring in her very own high-budget whodunit. Newly widowed and newly wealthy, her life suddenly became a cocaine-fueled rollercoaster ride of fast cars, male strippers, shopping sprees, amateur hitmen, lewd license plates, and a foul-mouthed parrot trained to curse at cops. But when prime suspects start dropping dead one by one, detectives find themselves tangled in a true crime story that sounds like a Coen Brothers movie script. Until a mummified corpse emerges from the Californian desert, its secrets held tight. Before a single fingerprint breathes new life into this bizarre investigation. Just how far will some go to protect their secrets? Hello and welcome to the Little Shop of Crime. In store today is a story that sounds like something straight out of Hollywood. Mainly because it happens in and around Hollywood, but also because it's just insane. Limousine parties, a hitman, a Subway franchise, a hitman's hitman, saucy money shots, hitmen hired as a hit on the hitman who hired a mummified finger. Look, it'll all make sense. Let's just investigate. This is the wild case of the Green Widow. It all started on December 9th, 1988, when police received a call from the home of 40-year-old Robert Samuels in Northridge, Los Angeles. His wife and stepdaughter had walked in to find him dead. He was in the hallway, half naked, with a gunshot wound to the back of his head. News spread fast. Bob Samuels was an accomplished Hollywood cameraman with an impressive resume. He had credits in some iconic films of the 80s. Short Circuit, Beverly Hills Cop 2 and The Colour Purple, to name just a few. According to his wife, Mary Ellen Samuels, Bob lived a quiet life. He certainly wasn't someone with a queue of mortal enemies banging at his door. She told police they'd been separated for 2 years, but were on good terms. There weren't any solid leads she could give them. But given she was the deceased spouse and the one who discovered his body, they naturally wanted to dig a little deeper into her. So they spoke to Bob's sister, and she gave them a detailed account of his and Mary Ellen's relationship. Born in 1947, Mary Ellen Gurnick was a teen of the 1960s. According to those who knew her, she had a happy childhood. A dog named Patches, trips to Disneyland, that type of stuff. In high school, she was described as eye-catching. Her nickname was Betty Boop. And she was the girl all the guys wanted, particularly young Bob Samuels. He was infatuated with her. They grew up as neighbours in Santa Ana, California, and were close even as kids. She was 2 years older, and he kept his crush a secret. He was a budding young photographer, a quiet kid, and she was perky and popular. But like so many young friendships, when they graduated from Santa Ana High School, they lost touch with one another. Mary Ellen went on to marry, and she and her husband had a daughter, Nicole. Bob and Mary Ellen's paths didn't cross again until 1979. By now she was 33 and divorced. He finally asked her out. They began dating, quickly fell in love, and 6 months later they were married and living together in his Northridge home. They were a close family. Bob formally adopted Nicole and helped Mary Ellen raise her as if she were his very own. Things were good. But after a few years of happy marriage, the cracks began to show, and the couple argued frequently. Bob may have worked in Hollywood, but he certainly didn't live a showbiz lifestyle. Mary Ellen wanted to travel. She wanted excitement, the high life, and he just wanted to be a regular guy. He worked hard. He was often away shooting on site for long periods, and she was bored. You see, Mary Ellen, she enjoyed the finer things in life. She went on shopping sprees, bought expensive clothes and elegant jewellery, but Bob didn't enjoy her indulgent habits. He earned well, but she spent even better. So Bob did what any normal person does to aid a struggling marriage. He bought a Subway sandwich franchise. Mary Ellen wasn't thrilled about it, but Bob thought it was the ideal solution. It would bring in some extra cash, and as the store's manager, it would keep her busy working, which meant less time for spending. But it didn't quite go to plan. The lavish spending didn't stop, and the lazy way she ran the business just added a lot more things to row about. So the arguments continued. They got so bad that the couple broke up and got back together repeatedly. The marriage had grown staler than a week-old whole wheat hoagie, and on October 2nd, 1986, Bob came home from a film shoot to find his wife and stepdaughter were gone. After 6 years of marriage, Mary Ellen left him a 5-page breakup letter on the kitchen counter. No matter what happens or what you think of me now or later, I will still always care for you. We just can't live together. She and Nicole moved into a condo in nearby Reseda, and Mary Ellen filed for divorce less than a month later. Bob was devastated. He begged Mary Ellen to put the divorce proceedings on hold, and she agreed to a trial separation instead. He was still besotted with her, and hoped they could rekindle what they once had. He even confided in a close friend that he was reading a self-help book, How to Save Your Marriage. They never did rekindle their past love, but for the next 2 years Bob and Mary Ellen did remain on good terms. They shared custody of their beloved schnauzer. She continued to run the sandwich shop, and he gave her an additional $1,500 a month in spousal support payments. And while Bob was hoping he could reignite the spark in their relationship, Mary Ellen was loving single life, hitting the bars and splurging on shopping sprees, while Bob's payments took care of the tab. That is, until he was found dead. The day before Robert's body was discovered, Mary Ellen called his home several times and left numerous messages on his answering machine. Apparently she needed him to have their dog the next day. There was no response, so she and Nicole took the dog around the following morning anyway. They let themselves in, and that's when they made the grisly discovery and the 911 call. Police arrived to find Bob's lifeless body in the hallway. It looked to them as though he'd been walking from the bathroom to a tanning room in the home. He'd been shot once, through a pillow, a rudimentary silencer. This was someone who knew what they were doing. But investigators thought the crime scene was odd. It wasn't consistent with a robbery gone wrong. There was no sign of forced entry and nothing had been taken, not even Bob's wallet. This was an execution, and whoever did it left nothing behind. No fingerprints, hairs, fibres or witnesses. Detectives had their suspicions about Mary Ellen's involvement, and she was asked to come to the station for questioning. And her behaviour didn't do anything to quash this suspicion. She didn't exactly seem distraught about her husband's death. In fact, her demeanour was a little more flirtatious, if anything. She turned up at the station wearing a low-cut shirt and was acting provocatively, deliberately bending over and making suggestive remarks. And at one point she told an investigator she loves bald men, whilst rubbing his hairless head. A gunshot residue test was performed on both Mary Ellen and Nicole. It was negative. Neither had fired a weapon recently. Mary Ellen also happily agreed to a polygraph test, so she could be excluded as a suspect. Amongst other questions, she was asked if she participated in the shooting of her husband. She said no. She was asked if she knew who killed her husband. She said no. She was found to have answered the questions truthfully. And so, with no evidence connecting her to the shooting and no obvious motive, they let her go. Meanwhile, an autopsy was conducted on Bob, and trauma to the head indicated he'd been struck with a blunt object prior to the shooting. He was likely unconscious when a 16-gauge shotgun was fired inches from his head, through the pillow, 12 to 24 hours before he was discovered. Investigators turned to Bob's divorce attorney to see if she could shed some more light on the lead-up to his death, and it turned out that just 2 months before he was killed, he'd filed documents seeking changes to his divorce agreement. It seems he wasn't feeling quite so generous anymore. Bob Samuels wanted to finalise the divorce and run the Subway restaurant solo, and he'd sought to reduce the spousal support payments from over $1,500 a month to below $1,200. Now there was a motive. Maybe Mary Ellen had realised she was better off financially as a widow than a divorcee. Despite their years of separation and the fact they'd been in divorce proceedings for 26 months before his unexpected death, they were still technically married, and so Mary Ellen got everything. And no sooner than the police tape was torn down, she and Nicole moved into Bob's old house. It was hers now. She also got his car, $6,000 in uncashed payroll checks. She sold the sandwich shop and pocketed $70,000. She refinanced the family home for another $160,000, and to top it off, she netted over $240,000 in life insurance policies. In all, Mary Ellen Samuels received over $500,000 following the death of her estranged husband, and this was in the 80s. And she went wild. In the months following her husband's death, Mary Ellen spoiled herself with jewellery, fur coats, designer clothes, and custom-made outfits from a store called Trashy Lingerie. Within 2 weeks of the murder, she was in Las Vegas. She hired stretch limos for bar-hopping jaunts, gave money to friends, and hired male strippers for private cocaine parties. 4 months after Bob's death, she threw an enormous birthday party for herself at the decadent Knollwood Country Club. Soon after, she met a new man and began spoiling him too. She bought this spanking new Porsche, which she paid $50,000 for, in cash. And she even treated herself to a new condo in sunny Cancun, Mexico. Seriously, it's like she thought the money was going to evaporate. But her fun was interrupted when police received an anonymous call. It was May 1st, 1989, 5 months after the murder. According to the informant, who identified himself only as a friend of Nicole, Mary Ellen had asked him to kill her husband, but he refused. He also told investigators they should take a look at James Bernstein. Apparently, Mary had paid him a large sum of money to kill her husband. He'd agreed, but he didn't fancy getting his hands dirty, so he outsourced the hit to an unsavoury character by the name of Mike Silver. The anonymous informant signed off with a poem, a code so police would be able to identify him if he called again. A rose is a rose, but the nose always knows. James, or Jim Bernstein, was 27 years old, and an honest electronics store clerk by day. By night, he was a wannabe gangster, a narcotics dealer who carried a business card that listed his occupation as simply specialist. And he also happened to be engaged to Mary Ellen's now 17-year-old daughter. Police dug into their relationship and quickly discovered that the very day after Bob's body was found, Jim had taken out a $25,000 life insurance policy, naming Nicole as sole beneficiary. Jim Bernstein was hauled in for questioning, and of course he denied everything, but he was nervous. It was clear he knew more. After 5 months with no leads, police finally felt as though the pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together. Mary Ellen had hired her daughter's fiancé to kill her husband, and he hired another man, the new prime suspect for the shooting of Bob. Mike Silver was interviewed, and they got nothing out of him. He had a minor rap sheet, but an anonymous tip-off wasn't enough to charge him with murder, and so without any evidence they had no choice but to let him go. Investigators paid a visit to Nicole's school and spoke to several of her classmates, and it seemed as though just about everyone had heard the rumours that Nicole's mum had paid someone to kill her stepdad. They also paid a visit to Mary Ellen's regular haunts, in the hope that she might have let something slip to her drinking buddies. She had. In fact, it turned out her search for a hitman hadn't exactly been subtle. She'd confided in friends that she was thinking of having her husband done away with, and she'd calculated that as a divorcee, she would only receive about $30,000. As a widow, she'd get $500,000. At first, she considered making it look like an accident, and she came up with some Acme-esque ideas of how she might be able to kill him and get away with it, including dropping a 400-pound can opener on his head in the sandwich shop, or making it look like he'd accidentally driven off a cliff. Then she began to brazenly attempt to solicit a hit on Bob. When one person would turn her down, she'd simply approach somebody else with shocking openness. Her friends had put it down to nothing but the liquor-fueled rants of a scorned woman going through a divorce. Police had heard enough, and Mary Ellen was brought in yet again for questioning. She was told that someone had informed them that she'd been out shopping again, only this time for a hitman for her husband. She vehemently denied everything, and she demanded to know who the informant was. They refused and told her they didn't want her accuser to face the same fate as her husband. What she didn't know was that police were also questioning Jim Bernstein at the same time, in a neighbouring room. After both had been interrogated and were suitably rattled, they were ushered into the same waiting area, but the tapes were still rolling. Jim was nervous. He told Mary Ellen that he thought one or both of them were going to get arrested right there for Bob's murder. He said the cops told him they knew 100% they were behind it. Mary shrugged it off, and little more was said. There was no direct confession, or anything conclusively incriminating, so they were both released without charge, for now. On July 23, 1989, nearly 8 months since Robert was killed, a body was discovered in the neighbouring Ventura County. Lying in an embankment off a remote mountain road 100 miles northwest of LA, the remains had been there for a while, mummifying beneath the heat of the Californian sun. An autopsy revealed it to be a man who'd been strangled to death. His larynx was completely crushed. But identifying him was no mean feat. A mummified hand was removed and one of its fingers was rehydrated, in the hope that a fingerprint could be gathered. And remarkably, it worked. A single print was obtained and run through a database, and thankfully, the victim had an arrest file. They had a name. James Bernstein. One of the key suspects in the whole investigation was gone, but he'd left behind a crucial piece of evidence. A Ventura County sheriff found something in Bernstein's apartment that LAPD detectives had missed during an earlier search: a phone card. The calling credit on the card had been used to discreetly dial both Mary Ellen and Mike Silver in the time surrounding Bob's death. In fact, it had been used to call Silver and the sandwich shop just 30 minutes before Mary Ellen made the 911 call. Jim Bernstein's body was formally identified by his boss, the owner of the electronics store. But his boss also had some information that police found very interesting. Jim had apparently confided in him, and told him he'd become so afraid he wanted to move away. Far away. He admitted he was involved in Bob's death, and was ready to confess. In fact, the last words he said to his boss before he vanished were, "I'm just going to go to the police and tell them what I know." Bernstein's death was a major blow to the investigation. Not only was he one of the prime suspects in the murder of Robert Samuels, but he was also someone who could connect the crime to his wife. And immediately, Mary Ellen was a suspect. If Bernstein was ready to confess everything, maybe she decided he needed to be silenced. Permanently. But she had an airtight alibi. She was in Cancun with her new boyfriend when Bernstein went missing. But that didn't mean she hadn't put a hit out on him. A hit on the hitman who hired the hitman who killed her husband. The case was now a double murder investigation with Mary Ellen at the centre of it. She was questioned numerous times in the following months, and by now her initial flirtatious attitude towards the police had long since subsided. They were too persistent for her liking, so she filed a harassment claim against the lead investigator, but that went nowhere. So she did the next best thing. She bought a talking parrot and trained it to curse and make offensive remarks at him. Seriously. Oh, and there was another number Bernstein had used the phone card to call. A woman by the name of Anne Hambley, who also happened to be Mary Ellen's best friend. Detectives looked into her and discovered this check for $1,500 she'd cashed, courtesy of Mary Ellen herself. This was enough to pay Anne a visit. And they hit the jackpot. A bag of Jim Bernstein's clothes and personal items was found in Anne Hambley's shed. The jig was up. She was hauled in for questioning. In exchange for total immunity from prosecution, she told police everything. And she knew it all. How Mary Ellen had paid Bernstein to off her husband, and how Mike Silver had done the dirty work. And she knew who killed Bernstein too, because she was the one who'd arranged it. His assassin was her live-in boyfriend, Paul Gall. Mary Ellen had advised Jim to stay at Paul and Anne's house in order to lie low and stay off the radar for a while. That's why his clothes were found in the shed. According to Anne, Mary Ellen was worried Bernstein was about to crack and confess all, implicating her in Bob's murder. She asked Anne for help to find someone to kill him, and in exchange she'd write off a $2,500 debt Anne had with her, hence the big money check. Anne roped Gall into helping by convincing him Bernstein had masterminded Bob's death and was blackmailing Mary Ellen. He agreed to do it for 5,000 big ones, and enlisted the help of his pal Darryl Edwards. And hey, since Jim's life insurance would pay Nicole $25,000, that would be plenty to pay for his own murder, with lots left over. Mary Ellen told Gall she was taking a trip to Cancun, and she wanted Bernstein dead before she returned. Police tracked Gall down, and cornered, he fully confessed to his part too. According to him, here's how it went down. On the morning of the murder, Paul Gall and Darryl Edwards met up in a bar and drank all day, between 30 and 40 beers apiece. Dutch courage. Later that evening they convinced Bernstein to come on a road trip with them, on the pretense of ripping off a drug dealer. They used one of Mary Ellen's cars, a black Celica complete with a personalised plate that read Nasty Vixen. Paul Gall was the driver, and Bernstein sat next to him, with Darryl Edwards in the seat behind. After 50 minutes of driving they were on an isolated dirt road, and Edwards gave the nod to Gall, who slammed on the brakes. Edwards wrapped an arm around Bernstein's neck and began choking him. Bernstein was screaming, so Gall began punching him to keep him quiet, but he missed one hit and struck Edwards in the side of his head, which caused him to loosen his grip. and Bernstein managed to free himself, open the car door, and make a run for it. The two men chased him down, and Edwards tackled him to the ground. Gall held his legs, while Edwards began choking him a second time. As he was being choked to death, Bernstein looked at Gall and mouthed, "Why?" Gall replied that it was because he talked too much. After a 5-minute struggle, Bernstein was dead, and the two men dumped his body over the embankment, where he was found weeks later. It was done. Anne Hambley called Mary Ellen in Cancun with a coded message to let her know it was safe to return home. Had it not been for Bernstein's murder, Mary Ellen may well have got away with Bob's, but in trying to snip off some loose ends, she ended up creating a whole lot more of them. Police wasted no time and went straight to Mary Ellen's house to arrest her. It was January 26, 1990, a little over 2 years since Bob had been killed, and they finally had her. She was charged with 2 counts of murder, with the special circumstances of multiple murder and murder for financial gain. Paul Gall was also arrested that day. Darrell Edwards handed himself in 5 days later. But what about Mike Silver, Bob's actual murderer? They never got the opportunity to arrest him. He was dead, having shot his girlfriend before turning the gun on himself. So police had now lost the suspected shooter of Robert Samuels and the man who hired him. Mary's home was searched, and in her bedroom they found the money shot. And I mean literally the money shot. A photo of Mary Ellen on a Cancun hotel bed, wearing nothing but a smile and $20,000 of cash in $100 bills. In the run-up to the trial, Paul Gall and Darrell Edwards were both offered a plea deal, which they accepted. Second-degree murder to testify against Mary Ellen. Mary Ellen Samuels was facing a possible death sentence, but prosecutors knew it wouldn't be easy to convince a jury that she'd masterminded 2 elaborate murder plots. She was highly persuasive, and this concerned them, so she too was offered a plea deal that would have spared her life. But she rejected it, and decided to take her chances in trying to charm the court. The trial of Mary Ellen Samuels, who was by now a 47-year-old grandmother, began in Van Nuys in April of 1994. The entire court case was described as playing out like a movie of the week, with all of the tales of amateur hitmen, crazy spending sprees and debauchery. Prosecutors had no solid evidence, and Bob Samuels' killer and the man who hired him were both dead. All they had was the confession of 2 self-proclaimed murderers who had a plea deal and a huge incentive to point the finger at her. So they went in hard on the motive. They opened their arguments with an enormous blown-up copy of the now infamous money shot to determine the motive. Robert Samuels was killed for greed. James Bernstein was killed for self-preservation. The picture helped to paint Mary Ellen as a woman obsessed with money, someone who would kill for it. By now the media and prosecutors had dubbed Mary Ellen Samuels as the Green Widow. Within days of her husband's death, she was spending his money hard and living the good life. They told the courtroom what Mary Ellen had worked out herself. As his ex, she would have received $30,000. As his widow, she got her hands on more than $500,000. Quite simply, she'd realised that Robert Samuels was worth more to her dead than alive. Paul Gall, Darrell Edwards and Anne Hambley all took the stand and testified against Mary Ellen, shielded by their plea deals and immunity. They really weren't short of people to take the stand against her either. 45 over the course of 3 weeks to be exact. Some testified that they'd been asked directly to kill Bob, others that Nicole had asked them if they could get a weapon for her, and some that Bernstein had confided in too. He hadn't exactly been tight-lipped about his role in the whole thing either. When a number of witnesses were asked why they didn't go to police earlier, they said they were worried they'd be next on her hit list. The defence denied that Mary Ellen had anything to do with either murder, and claimed she was being framed by an overzealous detective and so-called friends, who were pinning everything on her to spare themselves. They also attempted to portray Bob as an alcoholic monster who abused his wife and molested his stepdaughter from the age of 12. Nicole even took the stand against her own lawyer's advice and testified all of this on her mother's behalf. Then it was Mary Ellen's turn to be cross-examined. On numerous occasions she winked at spectators like she was the star of the show. She denied all allegations and maintained that Bob was an abusive husband. She'd left the family home because of 6 years of horrific abuse. All of this was dismissed as nothing but a pack of lies. No proof was offered to support the allegations either, nor was any of it in the earnest breakup letter she'd left for her husband, where she explained in great detail exactly why she was leaving him. She scoffed at the financial motive and testified that she'd only used the money to pay bills. Her lifestyle didn't change, so money was no motive, and she had no reason to kill him.
elephant shit.
She even roped her ailing and elderly parents into testifying on her behalf, to beg the jury to spare her life, despite the fact she seldom even bothered to visit them, and she hadn't even told them about the vast estate she'd inherited. But the prosecution tore her apart. She hadn't lived a modest life, and they proved it. She claimed she paid bills, but she defaulted on the mortgage, failed to settle debts on the sandwich shop, and she didn't even pay for a headstone for her husband's grave. It would have gone unmarked were it not for his sister. They showed photos of the Porsche, the Cancun condo, the expensive clothes, and evidence of the blistering rate she spent the money. The Green Widow spent every single cent of it in less than a year. But the most memorable piece of evidence was the photo of Mary Ellen bathing in banknotes. The meek, timid housewife routine was undermined by the picture that painted 1,000 words, or 20,000 of them to be more precise. On July 1st, 1994, after lengthy deliberations, the jury delivered a resounding verdict. Guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy, and solicitation. The luxurious lifestyle she relished as a wealthy widow, now just a memory, Mary Ellen Samuels sat in shock as the jury recommended the ultimate punishment: execution. Leaving the courtroom, the jurors described her as cold, selfish, uncaring, and evil. She was sentenced 3 weeks later. The judge described the evidence against her as overwhelming, extensive, vivid, and compelling. Mary Ellen was sentenced to death for orchestrating both murders. At that time, she became only the 5th woman in California to receive a death sentence. Paul Gall and Darrell Edwards were both given 15 years to life for their part in Bernstein's murder. There was never any concrete evidence linking Nicole to any of the crimes, so she never faced any charges, despite Mary's prosecutors describing her as an unindicted co-conspirator. But where is Mary today? Well, believe it or not, it's still ongoing. As of May 2023, she's 75 years old and still incarcerated. After multiple failed attempts to have her death sentence reversed, in November of 2019, it was overturned due to an excess of bad character evidence that was admitted in court. Her ultimate fate is yet undecided, but she'll probably just spend what's left of her life behind bars. And that's it, the story of the Green Widow. I don't know about you, but I'm exhausted. I genuinely can't wait to see what you lot have to say about it. If that case were a movie, you'd probably dismiss it as far-fetched. Anyway, as always, thank you kindly for watching. You're the best. Do us a favour, click the like if you liked it, and hopefully I'll see you at the next case. Ta-ra.